This does build on research I've been doing for many years on supply chains, especially garment global value chains. And it does build on this report I did in late March when COVID was just hitting in collaboration with the Worker Rights Consortium. What I'm doing now is I sort of did the report because of the circumstances and the urgency of the situation. Now I'm trying to step back and sort of figure out how this fits into broader debates and discussion. And that's where I sort of, and with some thought, came up with this title for this, the distribution of cost along global value chains. And prefacing that, I've sort of been feeling for a while we need to go back to some of those initial ideas of the distribution of benefits, not just because it's important to know who gets what, but because the distribution of benefits we know from the original global commodity chain research, global value chain research later, tells us something about power relations. I'm thinking here of Talbot I was looking at recently, but others have been saying this for a while. So if the distribution of benefits tells us something about power relations, it seems even equally true that the distribution of cost during a crisis should tell us a lot about power relations. So I want to start, before I get into the COVID context, I want to talk about pre-power relations and the distribution of benefits and the impact on workers, sort of outline my framework. Then I'll talk about the COVID pandemic and power relations and the distribution of cost and the impact on workers. And I'll do that in two parts. And I'll conclude with some just tentative ideas on where do we go from here and towards a new global architecture for global supply chains. Okay, so sort of the theoretical discussion, I actually summarize this a lot. You could go back to Gary Jareffi's original work on commodity chains. The lead firm indicates who holds the most power. A power which allows these firms to appropriate the greatest share of value create along supply chains. In the early 2000s, I think we were seeing signs that these power relations in garment supply chains perhaps were starting to balance out as suppliers took on more complex tasks. But I saw this as sort of an empirical question, and so I've been exploring that through my work since then. And here's my reference to some of Talbot's, among others, work. Changes over time in these distribution of benefits are key indicators in changes in the structure of change and shifting power along them. So if it's an empirical question, is power relation shifting one way or another? It seems here the literature is telling us we'll take a closer look at the distribution of benefits. And again, we could check that, but sorry, I'll start there, the distribution of benefits, then I'm going to get into the distribution of cost. So this is from seeing my work. I've done this, shown this chart many times. First way I looked at it is what's the price per square meter of imported garments coming into the US. And we see stability in the 90s, even a bit of an increase, and then this continual decline, except for the spike in cotton prices. So then just mapping out some things, I'll bring in more elements. Why do we see this decline in price? Well, certainly the trade regime has enormous impact on this. But curiously, I popped this up here, this transition is happening when we're moving from the sort of cut, make, and trim assembly model, the original sort of export processing zone model, where the factory owners received the fabric from the buyers. Sometimes it was already cut and they just would sew it together, and moving to full package, or some would call FOB production, which gave them, in theory, greater access to greater value added. But the question was, was there really a shift in power relations? So that's one, that's in sort of the squeeze down, suppliers in a sense, if you will, getting less, and workers as well. This is just more illustration. This is research I was doing in India. Workers were getting 55 cents an hour. Entire value of exports from India a couple of years back, 18.6 billion. But keep in mind, when we look at these export figures, you could have anywhere from 30 to 70% of that export value from imported fabric and other, just to illustrate Walmart's revenue, shareholder value. So as you go up from suppliers to buyers to finance, you see this accumulation. Just another way of illustrating this, probably seen graphs like this before. Some of them heard this many times. The wealthiest people in the world are in the garment sector. This is Ortega from Zara's and so on. And, individuals or families' net wealth far surpassing the export value of India. And probably lastly, a figure many of you heard before, Jeff Bezos pre-pandemic was making over $3,000 a second, and the average garment worker would make that in a year. Another way I look at this distribution, and this comes from, I actually signed up for a course on how you do pricing, and it wasn't meant for academics. It was meant for people that actually knew how to design and make garments. And in that course, this is sort of the breakdown they gave. If you're doing a new garment, how should you price it? And it's always starts from the top. What's your price point? And work backward. But this was the breakdown I got as I did the math. If this is the final price for that garment, the cut make component with 4%. Now I want to emphasize one point here. IMU means initial markup. So the vast majority of garments is going to be a significant percentage that are sold through markdowns. So this is pricing, excuse me, and how you do the initial markup. Well, my point here is if you talk about distribution and who gets what, a small percentage is cut and make. The fabric is more than cut and make, as we know. And this is partly the big distributional battles that we see as we travel around the world and go to places in Bangladesh and India and Latin America, the battle between what labor gets and what the factory owner gets. But it's from, my point here is from a relatively small piece of the pie. Okay. So what explains all this? If we're seeing, if the figures suggest, and there's many ways we can look at that much more systematically, that there is a dramatic unequal distribution of benefits in this case. What explains it? I would suggest some of the following points. You had changes in trade rules. So the phase out of the multi-fiber arrangement, sort of the liberalization of trade, coincides with China and then Vietnam joining the WTO. So the number of suppliers and supplier countries available to buyers dramatically increased, which creates sort of competition on the supplier side. Development policies, I refer to this as the fallacy of composition. Four so-called Asian tigers developed doing garment exports, and now it seems program after program is encouraging every country in some sort of transition to get into garment exports. Now, we have Myanmar for the crisis, you have Ethiopia and so on. And my argument there is, rather than the development we saw in the 50s and 60s, we run the risk of sort of having overcapacity rather than development. So the institutions that promote those policies, I think, would be contributing to this. Financial deregulation in the US, this really goes back to the Reagan administration, when it was allowed that CEO pay could be linked to the stock market performance, stock buybacks, and different things, which increased the role of finance, which then put more pressure on buyers in the supply chain to squeeze down for those quarterly reports. Technology. So the first three really gets into things governments did to contribute. Here are things that, once this ball started rolling, what companies were able to do. And, we have some really great research on Walmart. I'm thinking here of Abernathy and his collaborators, Dunlop, David Weil in the book. They were really looking at how technology barcodes allowed Walmart, as every time you checked out, to gather that data, analyze that data, and really hone in on their forecasting ability, which allowed them to grow. And we see a version of that now with Amazon, using its e-platform, not just to sell products and then charging those that use it to get a fee, but using it as a source of big data that they can then use algorithms for forecasting. And like Walmart did, decades before, outcompete competitors that way. So these are the factors I would suggest contribute to this. So, this is probably some of you have seen this figure before. This is sort of really that part in the red, the government rules that change, the financial deregulation, changes in technology, consolidation in some of these mega buyers, not all, right? This is not trying to explain every single case of a buyer, but supplier growth and dispersion and getting this crisis of overcapacity. And this gives increased leverage to buyers over suppliers. We have price squeeze and other purchasing practices. And then at the bottom, this whole range of problems: wage squeeze, intensity, building safety, freedom of association, environmental conditions, squeeze down on tax revenue, which creates a crisis in social protection. Okay, and this is just some quick evidence of this. I want to, because this is prior stuff, I want to go through this quickly. Here we see the prices going down, and here we see respect for worker rights going down. Data on the 20 top apparel exporters to the US. Here we see wage reports, Bangladesh, wages, most garment exporting countries not going above 50% of living wage rates. A lot of variation, some countries going up. Here we see China going up, other big exporters over a 10-year period staying constant. Work intensity, this is a theme I've been particularly interested in my recent research. And here, this is a link, if what we're saying is correct, that there's a price squeeze in that very first graph, make the shirt for $1, make it for $1.90. But if there's minimum wage increases, if fabric prices are staying constant or even going up, if shipping costs are going up, what gives? How do you stay in business if your costs are going up, but the buyer is pushing you down on price? And my answer, many factors, but the first thing that I see and what I hear when I talk to workers is work intensity. And the answer is basically telling workers to work faster. When I started doing this research years ago, workers actually would have daily production targets. You were told to do 600 operations a day, a shift. And as we know, they're not sitting and sewing a whole garment start to finish. They're doing the collar, the cuffs, the buttonholes, and so on. So whatever their task was, they would have daily production targets, and then they've moved to hourly production targets. And this is again from India, hearing them going from 60 to 80 to 100%. And this, to me, is how suppliers stayed in business. The problem, of course, is with this, eventually something's got to give. These production targets become inhumane, and workers just can't do it. The problem is, in many factories, supervisors have their pay, incentive pay, linked to the line meeting its production targets. So a supervisor is incentivized to actually become abusive. Verbal abuse, I documented 64% of workers said they were yelled at for not meeting production targets, but that very quickly can lead to physical abuse. Price squeeze, this is another thing. I look at this in a piece I did more closely in the review of international political economy. The argument here is, the order fluctuations with fast fashion go up and down and up and down. Factories don't know how to do staff allocations, how many workers to hire. Do you hire on the high end and low end? We know they hire on the low end, bring in 1,000 workers and then just push them into forced overtime. Or bring in contingent workers. The other thing, though, that sometimes I think is understudied is it creates those fluctuations, create an incentive to keep fixed costs down. Fixed costs would be your building expenses. So what do you pay monthly for your building cost during those low periods or those off seasons? And so that kind of system, because of those fluctuations, you're pushed to basically into unsafe buildings. This is of course, Rana Plaza, over 1,000 were killed, but this, wasn't an isolated incident. This is Bob Ross's work. I just put the numbers together in this way. Workplace deaths in Bangladesh, a 15-year period, starting in the 1990s, 451. Then a shorter period, 6-7 years period, goes up to 620, and then we get into 2013. Over 1,000. So it's been going up until, of course, we get to the Accord and the Alliance and all. Okay, so that's to contextualize all this, right? This is to say things were not looking good for garment global value chains pre-pandemic. And then the pandemic hit. We know, of course, we start to see disruptions in supply chains in January and February, started impacting products coming out of China, fabric coming out of China. There's a lot of disruptions, fabric not arriving because of lockdowns in China. But it really hits the industry in March when the shutdowns happen in Europe and the US and elsewhere. And this now flips the equation. So now we're in crisis mode, the biggest crisis, global crisis in the garment industry in well over a generation, much worse than the Asian financial crisis, much more global. So what happened during the crisis, and what does this tell us about power relations? This is the report Cornelia was referring to that came out March 27th with a couple of updates. So I'll present some of the findings for that and then give an update on this update. So here's the big part, and this is what gets right to the core of the power relations. We know that there were massive cancellations without paying. And of course, what does this mean? This is a system that has been moving more and more to delayed payments by buyers to the suppliers. So I ask you to make, let's say, order 100,000 shirts. I say I'm going to pay you $3 per shirt. You're going to get $300,000. The pricing terms pre-pandemic would have been somewhere between, on average, I'll show data on this, 30, 60, 90 days out. So for the supplier, everything is on credit, and the expectation you will eventually get paid. You buy the fabric, you buy the thread, you buy the buttons, you buy the zippers, you cut the fabric, you start sewing it together, you package it and get it ready to ship. And then you ship it, and then you wait 30, 60, or 90 days. So everything is sort of on your, you're on your side. You owe all this money. So when the lockdowns happened, retailers and brands used force majeure clauses, a sort of act of God, greater force, and said, we're canceling by and large. This is production costs, you're 91%, saying without paying. Okay, and this was, it struck the suppliers, by surprise. Many of them, and some very, very big, sophisticated suppliers, didn't know there was a force majeure clause in their contracts. The way a lot of these contracts work is at some point you start a relationship with a big buyer, and the lawyers will send you a contract that literally might be 400 to 500 pages long. There's one point it says you put it in the freezer, you stick it in the somewhere under the bottom drawer, and then you have all these short contracts that you start working on. And that it was in those original documents that you had to go through those really long original documents, and you found these force majeure clauses were just so broadly written that we can cancel at any time for any reason, including but not limited to the following, and natural disasters and so on. Lawyers and trade, were just really kind of blown away by this, shocked in the sense because they usually the standard, the logic went the other way. You as a supplier, you had an obligation to ship those shirts, but there was an earthquake or flooding or something else. The one that has the greatest burden of production would usually use that, not the one that's buying the item. I have some financial problems. I know I told you to make that for me, but I don't want it anymore. Usually it goes the other way. So to me, this here in and of itself is the clearest manifestation of the power imbalance. Okay, and quickly on this, and it's in the report, what does this mean for the workers then? Well, this is what we were able to document in the report. You either had two categories when this first hit. Either you were sent home temporarily on furloughed, or you were just straight out fired. What we were able to document was over 72% of furlough workers were sent home without pay. Over 80%, just over 80% were sent home without severance. And we estimated through this and our survey work in Bangladesh alone over 1 million workers were adversely affected. And of course, as we well know, these are mostly young women, women of color, mostly, many cases, internal migrants, very vulnerable in so many ways. So they faced the brunt of those decisions. There was pushback on this, and this is, it's a story of supply chains. It's a story of social movements and resistance. We did our report. It got coverage. This is something on it. It came out in the New York Times. This is, you can write a report, but if no one covers it, it doesn't usually have the impact you want. So the role of the media, the fact that the media grabbed the story and ran with it, was incredibly important. This is Rubana Haq, the president of the Bangladesh Garment Association. She was incredibly articulate and outspoken, just straight outright, calling out the brands for what they did. And this is an important part of the story, because one of the manifestations of the power imbalance is that suppliers are afraid to speak out against their sort of own, if you will, exploitation, the squeeze that they're facing. And of course, the reason being is, okay, so-and-so X company just cut the order. This is unfair. I'm stuck with all this inventory. I'm stuck with all the bills. I'm stuck owing workers' wages. I'm going to hold a press conference and speak out. Well, you'll be right, and you'll get some attention, and you'll also never get an order, not only from that buyer, but from all the others that watched what you did. So this is a very high risk thing to do. And the buyers and retailers, in my view, weren't expecting this. They weren't expecting. She was on the media every single day. They weren't expecting her to speak out so forcefully. One of the reasons, of course, that she could do this is she was doing it as the president of an association. It wasn't just, for my factories and so on. She could say, well, my factories are another story, and maybe I'm okay or not okay. This is all about the country and what's going on for the association and members I represent. Workers were a big part of the story, speaking out, protesting. These are workers literally lying in the streets, blocking traffic in front of a garment factory to get paid. We coordinated, the WRC took the lead on this. We actually started listing through a public tracker which companies had not paid up, which companies had paid up. I think this put a lot of pressure on this, and this led to very quick, this all happened very, very quickly, a hashtag pay up campaign, which really took off and ended up with a lot of these companies being bombarded, social media and so on. So this is kind of this pushback from all of this. Again, so many different elements that made up this campaign, and it was effective. Here's one article, Inditex, when it agreed to pay up. But we estimate that 40 billion in orders were canceled, and now at least 22 billion have been paid up at this point in time. However, going forward, I decided to go back maybe 6 months later to look at what was going on after that initial crisis, all the media attention, the cancellations and so on, and then the partial pay up. What did sourcing practices look like sort of going into the fall and into today? So let me put up some data on that. I did a second report, Leveraging Desperation, in October. And here are some of the things we found. And first off, a dramatic, as we can expect, dramatic reduction in order volume. This is every supplier I talk to, this is what has them on edge, just at, many cases, less than 50% or a fraction of what they were doing the same time a year ago. The issue here is, what do you say to the buyers? If stores are in lockdowns, if consumers aren't buying, of course, you're going to have a decline in volume. It's an enormous squeeze on these factories that are in a very precarious situation, and even greater squeeze on their workers. But it's part of the global crisis we're in. But here are things that really caught my attention and concerned me, if you will, from an ethical point of view. This continued squeeze down in price. And this is actually, I sort of looked, this comes from two sources. This was the second survey. The survey showed, and I asked, for the exact same product that you made July 2019, what are you getting paid July 2020. It's very important, right, to control the product. You want to make sure you're not making socks or making dresses. So I got like a 12, I think 0.4% decline. And then I actually went straight to the trade data when it was available. And it was right in the same area, 13% decline. When I put up that original graph of the squeeze down on price, the average year on year squeeze down, we're talking in nominal dollars. I do other graphs where I control for inflation, would be about 2%. So what this is telling us is that the buyers, and they explain this, and I'll show later, were really taking advantage of the dramatic overcapacity of the suppliers to squeeze down at a much greater rate than they had before, year on year. The other way, if I can, the way the buyers took advantage of the crisis was to shift payment terms. So here in blue was 2019 pre-pandemic, in orange is pandemic period. And as I was saying earlier, you see a lot, some do pay for about 15, 16% as soon as it crosses the bow of the ship. They can release it through these telegraphic transfers. Most pay later, and this is where sort of a lot fall in pre-pandemic, between 30, 45, or 60 days out. You see that entire graph shifting to the right, and most were paying 60, 90, 120 days out, right? So now you've got a smaller order, much smaller in some cases. Now you've got that order coming in at a lower price point per unit for this much smaller order. And now the buyers and some direct source retailers are paying you as much as 120 days, even 5%, saying 180 days out. If you averaged it out, usually goes in these 30-day, 15-day increments, but it was 43 days out they were being paid before, and it's now 77 days out. This is creating enormous problems in cash flow in the industry because the suppliers and their banks need to do two things. They need that money to pay off their debts for the fabric and other inputs, and they need the money to buy new material and so on to go forward. And they could get away with it before in this window. It wasn't easy, but this is pushing a lot out of business. I think this is the next question I asked. If these trends continue for the next 3 months was the full question. What's the likelihood you'll go out of business? And you see 32% said somewhat likely, 25% extremely likely. Impact on workers, sort of going from the buyers to suppliers, suppliers to workers. From January 1 to June, we see a 62% decline in employment, 12% increase. These are almost certainly the ones doing personal protective equipment. 26% at that time said no change. When I looked at the numbers overall from this, relatively small survey size, but it was showing a 10% decrease in employment. If you take the narrowest definition of a garment worker, full-time production worker for apparel exports, figures show there's about 35 million. If you bring home workers, it's going to be a lot more. Contingent workers is going to be more, certainly if you get into textiles and other sectors. But so what are we talking about here? Even with that very conservative figure of 35 million, we're talking about 3.5 million losing their employment at this period. This is June last summer. Other impacts, we see dramatic increase in hours of work. We see increased health and safety concerns, increased use of short-term contracts. We're finding evidence that in some cases, factories are dismissing their permanent workers, but then rehiring them on these short-term contracts because they don't know. Imagine them trying to forecast where the orders are going to go. Is Europe entering now a third lockdown phase and so on, a third wave of the virus. So they don't want to rehire workers with permanent contracts. So workers are moving from fixed contracts to long-term contracts to short-term contracts. And we've two different reports actually came up with a very similar figure, about 77% of garment workers and their families facing malnutrition now. I just actually poking around in this last night, some updates to give you a sense of the decline in imports for the US volume. This goes through the end of 2020, and you could see this is straight just units coming into the US or square meter equivalents. Here was the end of 2020. It takes us back to somewhere around 2009, 2010. The amount of product lost goes back, it's as if 10, 11 years of growth has been erased at this point. And here is looking now, updating, I had through July 2020, I was looking at this last night, the latest figures take us through the end of January 2021. This was pre-pandemic prices, that tail of that graph I put up at the beginning. Like I said, here, if you average it out, you see an average year on year about 2% decline. This is the price paid per square meter equivalent of apparel coming into the US. 2020, that full year for the apparel, and then 2021. No control for inflation. These are just straight nominal dollars. Okay, so I'm going to actually start wrapping up a bit here with where does this lead? One always wants to be optimistic, but let me start off with what a pessimistic view of what might be next. We can, and I believe we already are, see dramatic consolidation of the key winners during the pandemic on the buyer side, and that certainly is Amazon and Walmart gaining market share and control of access to the market. And we see massive bankruptcies. Some will recover, restructure their debt, and come back. And JCPenney's, some will not. Sears. We have others. Brooks Brothers. There was dozens really that went into bankruptcy. But Amazon really, I mean, we're going to still be trying to sort out the implications of how much it actually gained during this period. Again, one of the part of talking about the algorithms, one of the things that happened, of course, was a lot of brands weren't set up to do e-commerce, and they were pushed to use Amazon much more. They were selling their products through Amazon. Of course, the first thing we think of is, okay, well, that helps save those brands, and that's partially true. The second thing we think of is, well, okay, Amazon gets a fee for that, so that every time someone is pushed to do their e-commerce through Amazon, Amazon's gaining a percentage. But the other element is Amazon is gaining access to massive data that it doesn't share. So they know that, are you selling yellow shirts or blue sweaters or what? They know that before anybody else, what style, zippers, whatever it is, and they can get into their own marketing much quicker and do forecasting much better. So that this process is giving them unprecedented access to data. They will be in a far, far better position to do forecasting going forward. Consumer demand stay flat. Supplier competition for limited orders will escalate, increasing the squeeze on price in the crisis of overcapacity, right? So this is the title of that second report. Suppliers are desperate, right? They're desperate for orders, and it puts them in an incredibly vulnerable situation. I'll give you a quote from a CEO in a second that kind of confirms that. That trend. And of course, workers are going to face the greatest consequences: loss of hours of work, loss of job stability, shift to temporary contracts, and things we were mentioning. And again, it goes without saying, so with the worker part, the women at the bottom of the supply chain, the home workers, are the ones that are already very vulnerable and precarious, are absolutely going to face the greatest consequences, and they already are. The state public resources, I mean, I think, we need to talk more about this. Just as you squeeze on suppliers on price forever, right? We've seen a squeeze on tax revenue. The original export processing zone model was all about free trade zones and free of many taxes and fees and so on. Of course, the result is you're squeezing down on public resources for social protection, that really leaves you in a bad state when you have a crisis and you're trying to figure out how to do extended unemployment benefits and so on. And we're already seeing in response to this state saying, like Bangladesh was one, employers immediately saying the response to the crisis is to bring down tax rates even more. And we're seeing countries like India responding to the crisis by making their labor laws more flexible, more difficult to form unions. So here's the quote I was saying, like, if we had any doubt what's going on, this is CEO of Carter's, the Carter's and other brands. So here's his quote, was presenting his reports. Thankfully, given a more favorable environment for input cost and excess manufacturing capacity in Asia, we are forecasting lower product costs for spring 2021. So basically, it's just another way of saying there's dramatic overcapacity in Asia, and we're going to take advantage of that to leverage down. Like, we were thinking of doing this for $1.90, but you know what? We're giving you $1.65 to do this shirt, and take it or leave it, because we've got so many factories that will take it. And keep in mind, and we have this in our data, so much so that factories will knowingly take orders below cost just to keep the factory running and cover their rent and other expenses. They'll take it below cost to survive, sort of to fight another day. And buyers know that. So that's part of the dynamic. It's much worse to be totally shut down, but having to pay all your fixed cost each month. At the flip side, they're saying the expectation the product cost will be lower, right to this squeeze and overcapacity. We have no plan to lower prices in the spring. So we're not going to transfer that cost savings onto consumers, and therefore we're going to have gross margins expansion. We'll have a higher profit rate. More recently, this is referring to the full end of year reports, just Carter's, but so many, you could find this in so many different reports. The closing year, Carter's had a record operating cash flow, $589 million, much more than in 2019. And they're in their report saying the increase was primarily due to an extension of vendor payment terms. An increase of vendor payment, they're paying late. So they're holding on to the money in cash and paying late. They're shifting from 30, 60, 90 days out to 60, 90, 120 or 180 days late. And also they're deferring payments to retail stores. To me, this is part of how financial markets play into this. Warren Buffett years ago said he didn't trust a lot of these statements. People have ways of fudging assets and liabilities to make the company look better. They move how they depreciate products. They shift inventory and what gets charged when. So Warren Buffett makes the statement, you know what? He goes, I just go to see cash. If the company has a lot of cash, I know they're not in crisis, then I'll invest more. If they don't, it's a worrisome sign, even if all the other assets and liabilities look good. So ever since then, this expression comes out, cash is king. And I think the sign that a lot of these companies got was, if you're in crisis, when you do your publicly traded companies, do your quarterly reports or end of year reports, make sure you're showing a lot of cash in hand. That'll keep the investors in. But it comes at a price, and that price is someone. And here, the vendor, these are the suppliers. And again, it's a manifestation of the power imbalance. They get these extended payment terms because they have the power to demand them. Possible winners on the supplier side, larger suppliers. So not just Bangladesh and Vietnam, but the largest in those countries. I think they'll be picking up orders from China. They already started that. Now with the Uyghur situation and so on, I think they'll be picking up more tariffs and so on. They'll be picking up orders from the small and medium-sized suppliers that are going out of business quite dramatically as we speak. There's talk of nearshoring. Turkey could be for Europe, Latin America for the US. The experts I listen to and read, they're sort of saying they think this is overstated, that there just isn't the capacity, the price point, the range, the number of SKUs, I would say the number of the unique items that could be made in Asia is just not being met elsewhere. And think of nearshoring too. Sometimes there's a misperception. You're thinking all you got to do is move the garment factory where the product gets sewn together, and you did nearshoring. The bulk of the value is further down the supply chain. So are you moving the textile factories, the yarn and so on? If you're not, you got a logistical problem, and also most of your value added is elsewhere. So I'm not so convinced that's going to be a major trend going forward. The problem even for the Bangladeshis and suppliers, I talk to them still, they're still being very squeezed in this current situation. The squeeze has to be just right for them, that only the small and medium ones go out, but they're able to survive. It's a risky strategy, so it's not clear what's going to happen there. And it leaves many losers, as I mentioned, most notably the garment workers at the bottom. So how can we fix this? If we could sort of imagine what a different world would look like, I'll just state the obvious, which is going back to where I started in sort of that red box and flipping it. The question, of course, is always, how do you have the political will, coalition, dynamics to
Mark, sorry.
So I'll just say consumer countries, due diligence laws, regulation, balanced trade, development. I'll just flip all those different things. If the trade regime got us into this mess, reforming the trade regime hopefully can get us out of it. If deregulating financial markets got us into the mess, reconsiderations on how you do those financial markets and so on. Also the international system and producer countries have plenty to do in terms of labor law and enforcement. And social governments, this is not just a question for governments and for employers, but moving forward with what I call total costing for decent work, living wages, safe work tax regimes, binding agreements, encompassing collective bargaining. Honduras gives us an example.